Before I read Brian Teare's poem, Doomstead Days, I had never heard of a doomstead. It's a clever portmanteau, combining homestead with doomsday, an alternative universe where the homestead is a preparation for the climate apocalypse. The poem Brian weaves around his encounter with this word is a lyrical romp through our connection to land, water, and each other. Water flows, gender is fluid, and the rigid binaries of our imaginations dissolve. Brian's exploration of the doomstead unearths some vital questions about ecological crisis. How do we respond? How are we, as a society, fleeing to our doomsteads and hiding, waiting for disaster, hoping to survive? What does it look like for us to leave our doomsteads, engage the problems directly, and find collective solutions? I'm John Fiege, and this episode of Chrysalis is part of the Chrysalis Poets series. Brian Teare is the author of 8 chapbooks and 7 books of poetry, including most recently Doomstead Days, which won the Four Quartets Prize. He is the recipient of many awards and honors, including fellowships from Guggenheim, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Pew. He currently lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, and is an associate professor of poetry at the University of Virginia. He's also an editor and publisher and makes books by hand for his micropress, Albion Books. At over 1,300 words, this poem is much longer than the others we've featured on our Poets series, but it's worth it. Here is Brian Teare reading his poem, Doomstead Days.
This is Doomstead Days. Today's gender is rain. It touches everything with its little silver epistemology, modeled like a brook trout with 100 spots, white as bark scars on this slim trunk, thrust up from one sidewalk square, the 4 square feet of open ground given a street tree, twiggy perimeter continually clipped by parking or car door or passing trash truck that snaps an actual branch I find haunting the little plot its winged achenes auto-rotate down to. It's not that I don't like a wide sidewalk or the 45 bus that grinds right by, but if organisms didn't insist on forms of resistance, they'd be dead, of anthropocentric techno-mechanical systems whose grids restrict the living through perpetual stress that elicits intense physical response like an animal panic hitting the psoas with cramps or root fungus sunk in the maple's allotment of city property as tolerably wide as the migraine that begins at the base of my skull and pinches with breadth calipers my temples until the feel of flay arrays the dura's surface inside the bones, inside the head the healer holds in her hands and says, "The occiput is shut, flat, and irks the nerves that thread through its unappeasable shunt into the spine. I see a white light. I keep thinking about the way long drought dries out topsoil so deep beneath its surface. The first hard rain wreaks flood, taking the good dirt with it, the way today's wet excess escapes its 4 square feet of exposed root and rivers out, a flecks of sediment, alluvial over the civic cement of the Anthropocene, in currents a supple, rippled velvet done as Wissahickon Creek in fall's brief season of red and spawn, when brook trout in chill, quick shallows once dug into gravel to let nested eggs mix with milt and turn pearls, translucent as raw, unpolished quartz, each wide-eyed ova flawed by a black fleck my eyes close over. At the height of migraine, fertile error, waiting with incipient tail, ready to propel it deeper into nausea until the healer halts its hatching and calms neuralgia between the heels of her hands, pressing the occiput back open into the natural curve the bones forget, the way the banks of the Wissahickon have forgotten rapids, rinsing schist shaded by hemlock that kept the brook trout cold, each patterned aspect of habitat lost first to dams and mills and industry runoff and plots of flax Germantown planted for paper and cloth, made with water's power and hauled out of the precipitous gorge up rough, narrow roads south to the city port before Adelgids took the crucial dark from under hemlocks, sun heating the rocky creek down steep rills to the lower Schuylkill wide in its final miles, dammed at Fairmount for 2 centuries of coal silt and dredge, fabric dye and sewage that gave rise to typhus, and refinery spills that gave rise to fire, rinsed by this gender that remembers, currents circuit, anadromous shad and striped bass, leaving the Atlantic, heading upriver, shedding salt water for fresh in runs whose numbers turned the green river silver. If color counts as epistemology, spring sun on the backs of 1,000 shad is a form of knowing, local to another century, and the duller color of ours is the way the word gender remembers. It once meant to fuck, beget, or give birth, sibling to generate and engender, all fertile at the root, and continuous as falling water, molecules smoothing the sparkling gnarl of Wissahickon schist until its surface mirrors their force, the fuel element and fundament alike derive thriving from being at its biggest when it's kinetic energy headed toward intensity. Everything's body connected by this totally elastic materiality. I feel as ecstatic wide dilation when the shut skull gives up resistance to the healer's hands and the occiput opens its bones. My mind's eye goes, okay, I'm awake now, rowdy with trout, so as relaxed. My body's a conduit. It roars with water, passing from past to present through pipes and riparian ecotones alike. All of my fluids, pollutants cycling back into my own watershed, toxins and heavy metals bonded to blood, stored in liver and fat, C8, glyphosate, mercury, and lead. It's awkward. Okay. I keep thinking about the man who asked me to visit his doomstead, which seems kinky for a first date. What's the safe word for men with genders built for the world's end? Men with weaponized genders hoarding solar power and canned goods, bottled water genders tending small vegetable gardens out back behind the chickens, concrete genders sealed and lead, their doors secured from inside with thick steel bars, fringe, libertarian, end times genders, hetero, girly, camo gun calendars, apocalyptic tits pinned on brick walls by lone bunks so the men can cross out each day once civil society ends with a pathetic snivel like, please help. Doomstead men live Doomstead Days already, sealed in extreme fiction, as if there were ever a way to stay safely self-contained, by which I mean the Anthropocene is its own gender, biospheric in scale, its persistent flux from fossil record to Antarctic ice core so uncontainable, we all exhibit it with a local sense of personal chosen expression, strategic or contingent, like fertility, medicalized, tracked, managed, or casual, happy fucking without a condom. Risky, given the odds leveraged against us, and the blameless microbes seeking homes in our nooks and tubes, so I don't visit his doomstead. A psychic structure I feel in my head as block thought I watch play out in the Schuylkill where a pool's wide, shallow with silt above Fairmount Dam. I stand on the bank and know I'm not supposed to posit an analogy between the river and my body, but courtesy of this dam, the city siphons its water into me. Another human intervention diverting its path, each of my cells a little prison the river sits in, so we're related on a molecular level, so intimate, I think I can say at once speed and movement free, enough to jump the strained relation to human needs. It serves without relief, without the hands that hold my bones and tend my fascia that remember, a different posture without blockage or pain, a model for undoing harm done by capital, empowered to frack during record drought, millions of gallons of toxic wastewater injected into earth or kept in open ponds, prone and porous in western counties where river otters have rebounded after last being spotted in the Allegheny in 1899. Otters are raucous and chirp, chitter, chuckle, and grumble when wrestling together or sliding on ice. Playful biophony rivers have missed for a whole century, like brook trout rooting in loose, cool gravel or the plash of insects fallen from hemlocks. The intact eastern riverine biome, one serious mess of sound enmeshed in biotic patterns as heavy as traffic when the weekend weather is nice and I ride the early 27 bus to the Wissahickon. It's not that I don't like the city. It's just if biodiversity is a measure of health, a city is, by definition, sick with people and built structures crowding out other lives. Though I love signs, species persist. This sidewalk moss, probably Bryum argentum, native to guano-covered seabird rookeries. This fertile ginkgo stinking up the street with stone fruits crushed underfoot. This nameless fern in a downpipe drain, so modest in scale, like the simple songs of house sparrows everywhere, though this chubby one is hustling a fallen everything bagel of seeds and crumbs. And it's not that I don't like people either. Our sociality, genitals and smells, interesting diction, surprising privacies revealed at parties, bars, and in bedrooms, our genders and acts, various and wet, as thought product of dissolved salts, washing our brains in rich cognition that falters without water, which can't be taken by the head in the hands and held in the hopes of healing. Its body is too vast, its mind boundless. By definition, the world is awake. Be careful, my dears. It is the gender that remembers everything.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. I find this poem flowing through me in so many ways as everything flows through everything else in the world you conjure. And I love the resonance of everything at the end and the everything bagel before that. But let's look at the first few lines of the poem.
Uh-huh.
Today's gender is rain. It touches everything with its silver epistemology, modeled like a brook trout with 100 spots, white as bark scars, on this slim trunk, thrust up from one sidewalk square. So in this opening of the poem, water flows as gender flows, and dualities break down. Gender and sexuality binaries dissolve, as do the binaries of plants and animals, between human and non-human nature, between past and present. And looking at the poem on the page, it's composed of short single lines, sometimes only a single word like epistemology in the opening, or the last line of the poem, everything. And there's no capitalization or punctuation to interrupt the continual flow of the poem. The interconnectedness between words, images, and ideas. Everything flows like water down a creek. Can you talk about this idea or feeling of flow and what it means to you?
That's so lovely. Thanks for that reading. This book is a meditation in some ways on like watershed poetics. Or on what it means to kind of be a citizen and a creature of a watershed. And this is the final poem in the book and I think it is the most, in some ways, concerned with the question that's implicit in your question, which is a question about boundaries. And where there's this really wonderful French philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who has a question in one of his books called The Visible and the Invisible, which goes something like this, like where, if all the world is flesh, to put the boundary between the body and the world, something like that. And I've literally been thinking about that question for like 20 years. And it has changed over time for me. When I first began thinking about it, I was thinking about it in the context of the AIDS crisis and of losing loved ones and a partner to AIDS, and thinking about the sort of the body politic, the queer body politic, and the boundaries between our bodies and the virus, et cetera. And as I began to write into more ecological and environmental thinking, I was really interested in the fact that this question stayed primary for me, but changed in the context of a watershed, for instance, and in context of relation to water. And particularly, this poem was written during the Trump presidency and during a time of America First.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really interested.
It's all about borders.
Yeah, all about borders and a hardening, quote, hardening of borders. And I got introduced during this time to the notion of a doomstead, very much in the way I was introduced. The speaker of this poem is introduced to it, like through a casual flirtation, where a man is actually building a doomstead, and he wants to find a husband to bring to the doomstead. And I had never heard of a doomstead before. And then I did all this research into the doomstead culture and realized it was part of, or a response to, scarcity, environmental collapse, civil unrest, all of the elements of the 21st century as we know it. And they're so anti-environmental. They're so anti-ecological thinking.
Yeah.
They so deny the fact that we are mammals. We are incredibly porous. Every aspect of us, not just our orifices, but our skin, we're just built for porosity.
It also is this total denial that the problem is collective, and any hint of a solution has to be collective as well.
Exactly. So the doomstead is also very, as you're saying, individualist. Only the people within the doomstead get to have the resources that we've hoarded, et cetera. And so, this poem was really built, as you're suggesting, grammatically as a rejection of that. It does have boundaries in that each line is no longer than 6 syllables. That's the constraint. It's like I was trying to figure out how to manage the flow of the poem. So it's why epistemology is on its own line. It's a long, it's a very syllabically rich word.
Yes. I started counting syllables, and I discovered that epistemology is 6 syllables, which I'd never thought about before.
Yeah, so that's the actual just tiny constraint that enabled me to find a unit that is not boundaried in the sense of, like, there's, as you point out, there's no punctuation. So things are not subordinated to each other in traditional ways, which is also kind of, even though the poem's very vertical down the page, I wanted a sense in which often the way the syntax unfolds, phrases and lines, refer both to what comes before and what comes after. So they can't be subordinated to the grammar of either line on either side. And I really was interested. It makes for a deep flow of the poem, because that lack of subordination actually is part of that flowing. It also makes the poem, I think, sometimes you have to kind of stop and parse how it's what the actual semantic meaning is. But it was really was an ecological decision to try and figure out, okay, if everything's body is connected, if there is this like sort of wonderful elasticity to material life, how do you make a poem that kind of model that elasticity? So that's what I was hoping for. In sort of constructing the poem the way that I did. And it sounds like, you were able to key into that really quickly.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just there. And, and my job often is, to pull out little sections that I want to talk about, and it becomes challenging to do that because there are no obvious beginnings or ends. So I have to arbitrarily slice it up.
Yeah, which is fine. Which is fine. I mean, again, it means like in some ways I really succeeded.
No doubt.
But I think what you're also pointing to, and one of the things that I think is a great challenge for environmental writing is like, how do you create a piece of literature that models a different view of the world? Because we're so used to the poem being very short and portable, which has many virtues, right? A poem being easily summarizable, so that it delivers its message, particularly with environmental writing, where it's really trying to like get someone to think differently. And my challenge was really like, okay, how do I actually create a piece of writing that is immersive in a different view of the world, and that rejects the more technocentric, patriarchal, boundaried, resource-oriented, scarcity-driven model of reality that I find, so dominant in politics. And so terrifying, actually, for the future of our lives, and for the future of the planet.
I love that idea is, we all inherit a view of the world and a structure, even in our language and in how punctuation plays out, how ideas are organized on the page. It's all inherited. And I love that idea. As an artist or creator, how can you see that legacy even within the craft that you're working in, and how do you counter it? I also, working in film, this is an issue all the time. So many films that are environmental, what does that mean? It means they travel all over the world on airplanes.
Right.
Filming stuff, and I always talk about this with Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, which is an amazing work and on a lot of levels, but at the same time, what's the film about? It's about a powerful white man who flies on airplanes all around the world to spread the gospel, and it's just like, that's part of the problem. It doesn't mean it's not also part of the solution, but it's definitely part of the problem.
No, it's true. It's true.
But it's like when you start to think about how do you break down that form and how do you work against that, it's also, our institutions are not set up to recognize that and to value it and, ultimately to fund that type of work.
Well, it's true because as I think you know really well, especially in the sciences, what tends to get funded are things that mirror back to power the way power operates.
Yep, exactly.
And so critiques of power, or critiques, let's say, of science, which is allegedly neutral, but in other ways deeply ideologically imbricated with capitalism and patriarchy and all of those things, and whiteness. It is really hard to speak against those, and find a platform, find supporters, find people who will amplify that message. And then also when you're, I think, formally experimenting, and pushing against comforting and familiar conventions, let's say, of, quote, nature writing or environmental writing. There's even a difficulty, within people who are actually committed to environmental politics and environmental change, of also shifting what they might find really comforting about narrative forms, let's say. And so I think I think a lot about those challenges. And I also think in some ways it's what poets always say. It's like we're lucky that no one gives a shit about poetry because we don't, and it also doesn't take a lot of money to write a poem. So you don't have to necessarily get a ton of grants, but at the same time, when you are really committed, I think to change and to also changing the conventions of the conversation and the conversation of the forms of environmental writing and forms of environmental rhetoric, you do still run into resistance, I think. So it's another reason I'm really grateful that you invited me to have this conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, and it feels to me as if the poem travels kind of smoothly between the heavens and the specifics of your particular life on the ground. And you mentioned this before, but you name both the Schuylkill River and its tributary, the Wissahickon Creek. And historically, the Schuylkill River connected Pennsylvania's coal country to the city of Philadelphia and was a vitally important body of water in the industrialization of America. Can you talk about your connection to the Schuylkill River and Wissahickon Creek and what role they play in the poem for you?
Yeah, that's lovely. The Schuylkill and the Delaware are the drinking water supplies for Philadelphia. So part of what I did with this poem, because Philly is really bounded by both the Delaware and the Schuylkill, and the Delaware and the Schuylkill meet sort of at the southern tip of Philly. And when I moved to Philadelphia, I didn't actually, sort of stupidly, but also understandably, because I moved there from California, didn't really understand where I was moving. I knew what fracking was, for instance, but I really didn't understand that Pennsylvania has literally had pretty much every fossil fuel and
Yes.
fuel industry like sort of dominate its history. So the discovery of oil in Western Pennsylvania, coal mining, 3 Mile Island, now fracking. I mean, it's literally all of the things are there. And so the longer I was there and the more I was teaching environmental humanities and environmental literature, the more I was like, I just have to be literate in a deindustrialized city that I just don't understand its history or its architecture or its economics. So the longer I learned, the more I was like, oh, right, rivers are totally key to this history. It's why the city is even here,
Right.
are these rivers. And then these rivers, which we now drink, are actually have been so heavily polluted for so long. Basically, what I'm saying is like the more you research a river, the more you research everything, because everything is connected to the river, which I also, to be real, did not quite understand till I moved there, of like just how central the river is to the civilization and to, as you're also implying, like to the political and economic history of the United States. And so
in so many ways
they just unfolded, and I was just like, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed. Like, how much do I even get? Yeah, how much can I get into this poem? So
and so in so many ways, the history of humanity is a history of our relationship to rivers. Like think about the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Nile, and it's just like it is. The beginnings of civilization are all about relationships to rivers. It's so interesting. And if you look at every major American city, it's some access to some port, whether it's a river or a lake or an ocean.
Yeah, and it prepared me like that, as you're implying, like knowing that, learning all of that about Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. When I moved to Virginia, I was able really quickly to understand why Richmond is where it is, the importance of the James River, and then also understanding tribal relationships, like early American relationships to the river and tribal territories, and how all of those were also mapped onto watersheds here in a way that is both captured in what we understand and have been handed down from tribal cultures, but are also mapped into like John Smith's, narratives and sort of records. So
right,
all of that, I think, once you learn that history and the centrality of the river and of water to any kind of culture formation. Like you're then able to read it more clearly in any place you move. So
Right. Yeah, well, I have a strangely similar experience with Pennsylvania because I went to graduate school in
at Penn
geography
State, that's
at
right.
Penn State in geography. And, also little did I know I was going there to study cultural geography and environmental history specifically. But the geography department, it's one of those departments, they never quite know where to put it within the university. And so different universities put it in different places. But at Penn State, it was within the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences. And so I got thrown into learning all of that history of Pennsylvania, both through studying the physical geography of the place, but also seeing graduate students coming from all over the world, developing nations in the global south in particular, to come to Penn State to learn about coal and coal mining. And despite the fact that Pennsylvania was no longer a major coal producer, so much of the technical knowledge of how to extract and exploit coal is still there. And so, in nations that are still heavily dependent on coal, it was a place to come learn about it, which was really eye-opening.
It's not surprising, but it's also, one of those feelings of like, that's a powerful narrative because you can't but feel ambivalent about it.
Right.
Like, great job, Empire. We're amazing. So glad people are coming here to study how to fuck up the world better.
Yes, made me feel proud.
Yeah.
So you reference this history in the poem, along with the history of human interventions that interrupt the flow of water. And so let me read another section. The way the banks of the Wissahickon have forgotten rapids, rinsing schist shaded by hemlock that kept the brook trout cold, each patterned aspect of habitat loss, first to dams and mills and industry runoff and plots of flax, Germantown planted for paper and cloth, made the water's power and hauled out of the precipitous gorge up rough, narrow roads south to the city port before Adelgids took the crucial dark from under hemlocks. So I love how you embed these kind of focused ecological observations within a vast history of human assault, shaded by hemlock that kept the brook trout cold. And then later, this phrase I love, the crucial dark. There's so much resonance here with coal and water power that have given us electricity, which has allowed us to light up the world around the clock, and all the industriousness that's brought with it this widespread, indiscriminate ecological destruction. A loss not just of shaded trout habitat, but of the crucial dark, as you say. And it feels as if those words hold so many other meanings and histories. What is the crucial dark to you?
I really appreciate you pointing that out. I think when I was writing it, it was the most literal ecological meaning of that one of the things that hemlocks are amazing at is shade. They just provide this deep shade. And so really, I was thinking on the most literal level of how crucial the dark is to the trout habitat, of keeping the water cold enough for spawning and for the trout to live there. But I think you're right, absolutely, to read the crucialness of the dark in a really polyvalent way, of that this poem in many ways is a kind of hymn to the various kinds of aspects of habitat that are incredibly crucial to the kind of complexity of the functioning of habitat, and that to lose any part of the kind of crucial dynamic is to lose the crucial dark in the broadest sense of that kind of metaphorical reading of that phrase. So that a certain kind of cycle is broken, and a certain kind of habitat is broken. And again, something, nature finds a way to keep going in its way, but certain kinds of relationships either are ended forever in that space. They really don't come back. They turn into something else, which is wonderful, but maybe not as wonderful as what was first there, and maybe not in the kind of complexity that was first there. Things get decomplexified, and it takes, as any ecologist knows, it takes a very long time for complexity to emerge in its fullness, or re-emerge in its fullness, which I think of as healing.
Yeah, and to me, it's another binary of dark and light, and the fluidity and interdependence of those poles. And I think when I think about the crucial dark, I think about migratory birds,
Absolutely.
and literally millions of birds are dying every year because of light pollution, and either they're being disoriented, or they're avoiding areas, or they're colliding. They can't see the stars as well. All kind of stuff that's totally messing with birds and their migratory patterns.
Absolutely.
And then I also think about your mention of the shade that the hemlock produces. Shade has become this cultural cultural thing where you're throwing shade, and it's just like very negative connotations, and it's just like it's so anthropocentric in the sense that like we as humans, we worship the sun and we like the light. And the darkness is a scary thing for us because there could be animals hiding, waiting to jump us, and we really value and privilege the light over everything else, which is not appreciating the fullness of the importance of different states of being within the world.
Oh, absolutely. And also to add to that, like shade is crucial, especially in urban areas, like the diminishment of tree canopy, particularly in low income areas, has devastating health consequences for the people who live in those neighborhoods. And Philly is definitely a city where it can be a problem. Like it's really crucial in urban heat islands to increase the tree canopy, to sort of, really do some work to get those cities to cool down.
Yeah, and just like we have to be very conscientious around different ways of being between cultures, different ways of relating to the world, it's so crucial to be aware of how different species relate to the world, and they need different things than we do oftentimes.
Yeah.
We share things that we need, but we also have crucial differences. And part of being a sensitive citizen of culture and a sensitive citizen of the world is to appreciate how you are not the same as everything else, whether it be another person or another species.
It's true. Absolutely.
I'd like to read a slightly longer excerpt. My body's a conduit. It roars with water, passing from past to present through pipes and riparian ecotones alike. All of my fluids, pollutants cycling back into my own watershed toxins and heavy metals bonded to blood, stored in liver and fat, C8, glyphosate, mercury and lead. It's awkward, okay? I keep thinking about the man who asked me to visit his doomstead, which seems kinky for a first date. What's the safe word for men with genders built for the world's end, men with weaponized genders hoarding solar power and canned goods, bottled water genders, tending small vegetable gardens out back, behind the chickens, concrete genders sealed in lead, their doors secured from inside with thick steel bars, fringe libertarian, end times genders, hetero girly, camo gun calendars, apocalyptic tits, pinned on brick walls by lone bunks so the men can cross out each day once. Civil society ends with a pathetic snivel like, please help, doomstead men live, doomstead days already, sealed in extreme fiction, as if they were ever a way to stay safely self-contained, by which I mean the Anthropocene is its own gender, biospheric in scale, its persistent flux from fossil record to Antarctic ice core, so uncontainable. So in this section, there are so many genders happening. And I just love how you're even using the word gender. It's slightly different than the way we tend to use the word gender. And in this, you have weaponized genders and bottled water genders, concrete genders, fringe libertarian end times genders. The Anthropocene is its own gender. And at the center of these ricocheting genders, you have this amazing word, doomstead, which we've talked about as so evocative of what's wrong with our collective response from climate change. But at the same time, you breathe, through the poem, you breathe life and vitality and whimsy into this kind of terrifying, stultified word of doomstead. I keep thinking about the man who asked me to visit his doomstead, which seems kinky for a first date. Can you talk more about this word doomstead? Even, you mentioned it before, but I'm really wondering if we can dig into how it relates to gender and queerness, and what else is going on here in this section.
Thanks for that invitation. I think we have to go back, though we don't have to go back that far, and think about how gender in particular felt during the Trump administration. And when we were looking at Trump, we were looking at Scott Morrison in Australia. We were looking at Bolsonaro in Brazil. We were looking at Putin. Boris Johnson. We're looking at all of these terrible white men, like absolutely kind of the worst of the lot. All of whom are like, environmental destruction, great, more money for me. So it's
like really, evidence of their power and their
totally
rule.
I mean, really dispiriting times. Not that we're not still in them, FYI, but there are these moments, I think, that we ride like waves where you just suddenly are like, oh my God, the end times are really here, and these men are like avatars of this experience. And so I think in some ways the poem was kind of, to make it a little funny for myself, was a way to take some power away from them. I think because I found them really overwhelming. I found, Ryan Zinke. I found Scott Pruitt. I found all those people just so terrifying. And this kind of cast of white male characters who just had this kind of doomstead mentality to me. I kind of couldn't handle it. And
poetry is therapy.
I mean, I think of it more as like a kind of exorcism of like, you have to call the demon into being to cast it out. And I'm being real, like that, I think, was what this part of the poem was trying to do, was to also sort of, they're all so tied, that sort of idea is so tied to objects and to capitalist culture and to consumption. And in speaking with this Doomstead guy, I was so struck by how detailed the plan was. And also how it really did hinge on all of these kind of objects. Hence the bottled waters and the sealed door and the, concrete and all that kind of stuff. And And so I think this section of the poem was a way to kind of both make fun of that figure, who I do think is as laughable as he is terrifying, and thus to sort of take some power away from him. But I think that segue to say, like, because I do think a lot about, as someone who teaches, queer history, queer theory, queer literature, feminist history, feminist theory, and feminist literature. I do think a lot about the relationship of gay liberation, women's liberation to the Anthropocene, and to things like the pill, and the way that pill was marketed in a plastic container that was discreet and looked like a compact, and that enabled it to infiltrate into everyday life in this very convenient and discreet way, as well as the chemicals, the hormones that go into the pills, and then later, the pharmaceutical industry really being able to intervene ultimately after much activism in the AIDS epidemic. And so I think a lot about the ties between, gender liberation and these aspects of the Anthropocene, like the chemical industry, the plastics industry, pharmaceutical industry, that I think are really important and crucial tools for identity, articulating identity, but also like sort of shaping a gendered life. But I wanted to put all of that and also IVF, which I mentioned, like fertility, all those things. Those are all aspects of articulating gender and sexuality in the Anthropocene that actually, I think, are on a continuum with the Doomstead. I think the Doomstead actually is also an articulation of gender.
Yeah.
And maybe one I really don't like and am really disturbed by, but I wanted to make sure that I didn't just single those guys out for, sort of to be made fun of, and to sort of really show that they're part of it. We all do this work of articulating the Anthropocene through our genders.
Right.
And that, some of us, I think, we're really happy about the ways that we do those things. And we all feel really lucky, about how we get to do those things. But now, as we've seen with Roe v. Wade, like, those are also historical, and they're part of, they're part of a cultural struggle that, again, is being articulated within this larger framework of democratic crisis and environmental collapse, and, et cetera.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that, as you say, the Doomstead avatars, of Elon Musk and Donald Trump and Boris Johnson and Putin, they are decidedly straight and heteronormative. And I find it interesting that you've spun that here, and this Doomstead guy is not straight. So talk about that a little bit.
I mean, that's was maybe, just sort of a gem of real life, of like, that was literally just an actual person.
Right.
And
Isn't that the beauty of the real world is it
also
defies stereotypes.
And that also showed me that, it's not that gay men don't have a relationship to toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
And haven't fetishized, versions of masculinity that are like incredibly problematic, and violent, And so this was a really good example of someone who, again, kind of dressed themselves in this kind of liberal homesteady, particular way that I did find not alarming and a bit seductive. And then, he did a really great job of sort of slowly unveiling his deeper held beliefs and ideas. And so I was really, kind of, again, I found it after I got over, like, okay, I have to stop talking to this person. I found it really interesting because it was surprising to me. But it was, I think it's just another example of like a way. This is someone who, of course, worked in the tech industry, and was able to build a life along the lines of some of these avatars of the Doomstead, and really had drunk that Kool-Aid.
Right.
In his own way, but was articulating it within his own framework of sexuality, which I find all that very interesting. But yeah, I was surprised.
And another review of your book mentions the connection between this work's form and the romantic lyric, where the poet strolls along riverbed or down city street and contemplates nature or meditates on God, like Shelley or Wordsworth. Do you feel as if this poem is in conversation with that romantic lyric?
That's a great question. I think to the extent that it uses some of the tools of sort of the history of prosody, like rhyme, for instance, and alliteration of prosody in English, and that it is thinking in some ways through rhyme and resemblance as a way of sort of showing the interconnection of the world and the sort of way everything is connected to everything. And then also the way there's a central, a lyric I, speaker. I do think those things, they can't not be a part of that continuum.
Yeah.
But I also think, it is unlike those writers who did not know that they were in the Anthropocene.
Mm-hmm.
This is a poem that has a self-reflexivity about it, that has a kind of knowingness about where it is cited and when it is, that I think is unique to and different from poems from that sort of historical continuum. So I do think it's probably, I can't claim that for myself, but I can say, like, yeah, I see it. I can see that as a continuum, but I think there are ways in which, it doesn't, sort of idealize the natural world in the ways that a poem of the Romantic tradition would want to. And yeah, I think it's doing a different kind of work, but depending definitely on some of the tools of that tradition. Yeah.
I also can't help but think of Allen Ginsberg. And and in a way it's like, I don't know, if I just feel like you're writing in a different time, and that's so a lot of the politics and the references are different because of a different historical moment, but there's so much resonance formally and in terms of positionality within the culture. Can you talk a little bit about Ginsberg and whether what your thoughts are on the relationship between this poem and what he was doing?
Well, that's kind of a wonderful from left field for me, just in that he's someone who is kind of an elder that I deeply respect and have read. And, I lived in San Francisco for a long time, so it's kind of impossible not to have Ginsberg in your world as a poet in the Bay Area. And I definitely feel like his sexual frankness, his outness at a time when that was not something you could take for granted, his role in gay liberation, and then also his, radical critiques of capitalism, war culture. I have a deep respect for him as a kind of ancestor poet. That said, what of him might be in this poem is maybe like my unconscious or like my having absorbed or read him. I really wasn't writing this like with a reference to him in particular, in part because like I feel like I'm doing some stuff around both rhyme and alliteration and also the short lines that are so antithetical to his way of kind of moving through a poem.
Right.
Like he's so, it's not that he never wrote syllabic poems in reference to sort of Japanese literature or haiku or that tradition, but I still associate so much of his work with a really ebullient post-Whitman free verse kind of, without a lot of constraints.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, but that's a lovely question. I like invoking him.
Cool. Yeah, and I think might be it was the flow.
Yeah,
and the the non-stopness that I was thinking about. And another word I love is biophony, the collective sounds produced by all the living organisms in a particular biome. So let me read another fairly long passage. A different posture without blockage or pain a model for undoing harm done by capital, empowered to frack during record drought millions of gallons of toxic wastewater injected into earth or kept in open ponds, prone and porous in western counties where river otters have rebounded after last being spotted in the Allegheny in 1899. Otters are ruckus and chirp, chitter, chuckle, and grumble when wrestling together or sliding on ice. Playful biophony. Rivers have missed for a whole century, like brook trout rooting in loose, cool gravel or the plash of insects fallen from hemlocks. The intact eastern riverine biome, one serious mess of sound enmeshed, in biotic patterns as heavy as traffic when the weekend weather is nice and I ride the early 27 bus to the Wissahickon. It's not that I don't like the city, it's just that if biodiversity is a measure of health, a city is, by definition, sick. So I feel like sound is something that is neglected in our assessment of how we've impacted ecological systems. But it's this amazingly revealing measure of biodiversity and ecological health. And some species will flee an area completely when the sounds produced by human development begin to enter. And I love your simile that uses the word traffic in sound enmeshed in biotic patterns as heavy as traffic when the weekend weather is nice. And of course, poetry is so much about sound and rhythm and how sounds bounce off and relate to one another. Can you talk to me a bit about biophony and how that word and that idea made it into this poem?
Yeah, thank you for pointing to that. It came through, as I think won't surprise you or other people, through the work of Bernard Krause. I just had not thought into the oral landscape of a biome before reading his work, because I do think of my poems as soundscapes in their way. I was very moved to be like, oh, of course the world is a soundscape. Of course an ecosystem, an intact ecosystem, has a particular soundscape and a particular richness that's about actually the sound of relationship. And so he also has all these charts that sort of show the soundscape, at its fullest, and then shows the diminishment over time of the complexity of the sounds as the ecosystem degrades, and so or loses the partners in its relationships. So I that's where that came from. And then that sort of hooked me into thinking about the Wissahickon as a place where that soundscape had changed, and I couldn't access the original biophony of that place, or, a less interrupted biophony of that place. And again, it's still, I think, one of the tensions in the poem is between, it's still a side of that elastic materiality of all, there's still relationality and connection and so much happening there. But it's also really hard not to experience the impacts and the effects of a long history of human habitation and industry, and the notion of how deeply decreased biodiversity is in any human landscape.
Yeah, I think about this all the time. There's this wetland area near my house that I like to run with my dogs up there, and there's a boardwalk that goes through the wetland area. It's real short, but it's just absolutely gorgeous, and there are lots of animals back there. And but it's right next to this busy road.
Yeah.
And pretty much, unless you're there really early on a Sunday morning or something, it's just, you can't hear anything but the traffic, even though you're surrounded by all this beauty and you can't see the traffic. And it's just like, how does this impact the animals?
Yeah, no, I mean, and in Philly, everything was like that. There was a really wonderful wetland, like Drew Hines, I think it was preservation area, but it's literally right next to the highway. And then on the other side of it is the airport.
Right.
And then there's also oil lines through the wetland, which have actually leaked before. So, there was no place. And I think that was important for me, again, coming from California, where there's been a ton of conservation work, and I had access to a lot of more of places that had at least the illusion of a kind of wildness or of distance from human habitation, and a lower impact. It was important for me to live in Philadelphia and really reckon with actually, this is more the real picture of what our world is like. These kind of fantasies I could have a little bit in California,
Right,
were really fantasies. And so, yeah.
Well, and just the way, our society works is, I think about this road. This road is so unnecessary. But, it's a through road, but there's so many other paths to the same place. But the process of shutting down that road, would just be a massive political undertaking. Yeah. And it would just, once a road is built, it's so hard to change it.
Yeah, no. And then also, one thing I learned from doing research into other sites, into Pennsylvania's industrial history is it's really hard to begin to recover from certain kinds of human infrastructures and human endeavors. And it takes, it takes longer than our lifetimes for certain things to even begin to recover, if they even can. Yeah. And then they never go, they just don't go back to what they once were. They will become something else, and hopefully something amazing. But once you wound, how do you heal it, or what does healing even look like?
So throughout the poem, there's an interesting dance between the human and the non-human. You make a distinction between the two, often with moral weight falling more to the non-human, but at the same time, you break down the binary of human, non-human, and firmly place us as part of nature, not distinct from it. And let me read the end of the poem, which I think explores these questions. And it's not that I don't like people either. Our sociality, genitals and smells, interesting diction, surprising privacies, revealed at parties, bars, and in bathrooms, our genders in acts, various and wet, as thought product of dissolved salts, washing our brains in rich cognition that falters without water which can't be taken by the head, in the hands and held, in the hopes of healing. Its body is too vast, its mind boundless. By definition, the world is awake. Be careful, my dears. It is the gender that remembers everything. So why must we be careful?
Oh gosh, I mean that's such a pot. There's 100,000 answers to that question. I think because all life on the planet depends on care, on our being careful, because we've been really careless for a really, really long time, particularly in the global north. And then the question of what it means to heal something that we have damaged. We, as I think most people know, we don't actually know how to heal most things we've damaged. We damage them and then are like, oh shit, we did this damage. What do we do? And often we don't know what to do. We don't know how to store nuclear waste. We don't know, without, killing half of people. We don't know how to use PFAs. We don't know how to clean up PFAs. I mean, the list goes on, just endless.
Yeah.
And so I think partially it's just we've been careless, and the world remembers every single one of these wounds. It does not have the will to reject what we do to it. It's one of the most tragic things about our relationship to the planet, is it cannot say no. It cannot give consent. And so, because that power imbalance is so radical, it has the appearance of sovereignty, or that's what we've always told ourselves. But I just think that's it has been a dangerous way to proceed. And it is not just dangerous, it is, as we now know, it's mortal and apocalyptic as a way to proceed. And so I think, I think I really thought about, the ways in which our own bodies sometimes can heal from the stress and damage of the world, but there just isn't an easy way to take, let's say, an ecosystem, and hold it in the hands and do a healing treatment on it. You can't seize a whole set of really complicated relationships, many of which we are not even visible to us and we don't understand.
Right.
You can't even heal something that you can't see and you don't understand.
Right.
So
and
I
thus,
think
you must be careful.
Yeah, we have to be really careful. So I think all of that, I mean, there's 100,000 ways to read that, but that's the beginning of my sense of fear and caution, and also a little bit of hope. I think when people do really set their minds to take care, some really incredible things really do happen. But the Doomstead men are many and are very powerful, and believe in this kind of sovereignty that I think is, unfortunately, it's really a dead end for life. So
Right. Well, and I love this idea of care and being careful, because it's something that we can all do. It's something we all have access to. Oftentimes these questions and problems are framed in terms of solutions, like how do we solve the problem? And it's so hard for us to say, here's something that solves the problem. But if it's more couched in terms of it's important to be careful, we can all do that. It doesn't mean we won't have missteps. It doesn't mean we understand everything. But we can certainly be careful. And that's a way to approach the world. And as you've said, a way in which we are not approaching the world, and historically have often not approached the world. So I find it enormously helpful and powerful frame about how we can march forward through these really difficult questions and issues without being held up and obstructed by this problem solution binary that we're so caught up in.
Agreed. And I think because the solution framework is often, again, not to be overly reductive, but is often within government, within industry, and again, often conducted by doomstead men, or people who are maybe trying to combat that ideology, but are doing it within a framework that is like inherently extractive and dangerous, and influenced by money, controlled by outside interests, perhaps. I think it's really hard to take care when there are all of these competing interests, sort of baked into that framework. And I think the notion of care, I think a lot about the ways in which there's a kind of joke on Twitter that like sort of the notion of self-care is often just, white people enjoying their own privilege. Like, oh, treat yourself. It's like, but your whole life
Right.
is a treat. Like, what?
Go to spa for the day.
Yeah. So
for $800.
Yeah. So I think the notion of like, if we're so invested as a culture in kind of in self-care, and I think extending the notion of care outward, and thinking about actually caring for the relationships that we're intrinsically and sort of helplessly a part of, to water, to air, to our food sheds, to the creatures who live around us. That is also, if we want to be like truly anthropocentric assholes and still environmentalists, you can say, well, that is still caring for yourself. Like, if you really want to care for yourself, you should also care for those things, because you're a part of all that.
Right.
So if you don't want to be altruistic, you can still be selfish that way. But I do think, trying to think. I also think there's a flexibility in taking care that like sort of solution feels so like rigid to me. And like care has options, I think.
Yeah.
And is also sort of like maybe contextual, like what would look like care in one landscape or one habitat, or it would be totally different in another landscape and habitat, and what cares for a certain kind of species just really wouldn't care for another kind of species. Water needs a different kind of care than, trees, etc. So,
well, I feel like so much of what we need is moving these conversations into the framework of values and community and collective understanding and action around these things. And care is such a powerful way into that. It's not fixed, as you say. And it moves the conversation into values. What do we care for? What do we value? And it's not about this kind of technocratic, economistic kind of conception of everything.
no, it's true. I mean, it obviously anything can be co-opted.
Right.
but yeah, I agree that it suggests a powerful counter to those models.
Well, can you end by reading the poem once again?
Yeah, I love thinking of how different this will sound even to me.
Great.
Yeah, thank you again for this rich conversation. Okay, this is Doomstead Days. Today's gender is rain. It touches everything. with its little silver epistemology, modeled like a brook trout, with 100 spots, white as bark scars, on this slim trunk, thrust up from one sidewalk square, the 4 square feet of open ground given a street tree, twiggy perimeter continually clipped by parking or car door or passing trash truck that snaps an actual branch. I find haunting the little plot its winged achenes auto-rotate down to. It's not that I don't like a wide sidewalk or the 45 bus that grinds right by, but if organisms didn't insist on forms of resistance, they'd be dead. Of anthropocentric, technomechanical systems whose grids restrict the living through perpetual stress that elicits intense physical response, like an animal panic hitting the psoas with cramps, or root fungus sunk in the maple's allotment of city property as tolerably wide as the migraine that begins at the base of my skull and pinches with breath calipers my temples until the feel of flay arrays the dura's surface inside the bones. Inside the head, the healer holds in her hands and says, "The occiput is shut." Flat and irks the nerves that thread through its unappeasable shunt into the spine. I see a white light. I keep thinking about the way long drought drives out topsoil so deep beneath its surface. The first hard rain wreaks flood, taking the good dirt with it. The way today's wet excess escapes its 4 square feet of exposed root and rivers out a flecks of sediment, alluvial over the civic cement of the Anthropocene in currents, a supple, rippled velvet done as Wissahickon Creek in fall's brief season of red and spawn, when brook trout in chill, quick shallows once dug into gravel to let nested eggs mix with milt and turn pearls, translucent as raw, unpolished quartz, each white-eyed ova flawed by a black fleck my eyes close over at the height of migraine. Fertile error waiting with incipient tail, ready to propel it deeper into nausea until the healer halts its hatching and calms neuralgia between the heels of her hands, pressing the occiput back open into the natural curve. The bones forget the way the banks of the Wissahickon have forgotten rapids, rinsing schist shaded by hemlock that kept the brook trout cold, each patterned aspect of habitat lost, first to dams and mills and industry runoff and plots of flax Germantown planted for paper and cloth made with water's power and hauled out of the precipitous gorge up rough, narrow roads south to the city port before adelgids took the crucial dark from under hemlocks, sun heating the rocky creek down steep rills to the lower Schuylkill, wide in its final miles, dammed at Fairmount for 2 centuries of coal silt and dredge, fabric dye and sewage that gave rise to typhus, and refinery spills that gave rise to fire, rinsed by this gender that remembers. Currents circuit, anadromous shad and striped bass, leaving the Atlantic, heading upriver, shedding salt water for fresh in runs whose numbers turned the green river silver. If color counts as epistemology, spring's sun on the backs of 1,000 shad is a form of knowing, local to another century, and the duller color of ours is the way the word gender remembers. It once meant to fuck, beget, or give birth, sibling to generate and engender, all fertile at the root and continuous as falling water, molecules smoothing the sparkling gnarl of Wissahickon schist until its surface mirrors their force, the fuel element and fundament alike derive thriving from, being at its biggest when its kinetic energy headed toward intensity, everything's body connected by this totally elastic materiality. I feel as ecstatic wide dilation when the shut skull gives up resistance to the healer's hands and the occiput opens its bones. My mind's eye goes, okay, I'm awake now. Rowdy with trout, so as relaxed. My body is a conduit. It roars with water, passing from past to present through pipes and riparian ecotones alike. All of my fluids, pollutants cycling back into my own watershed, toxins and heavy metals bonded to blood, stored in liver and fat, C8, glyphosate, mercury, and lead. It's awkward. Okay. I keep thinking about the man who asked me to visit his doomstead, which seems kinky for a first date. What's the safe word for men with genders built for the world's end? Men with weaponized genders hoarding solar power and canned goods, bottled water genders tending small vegetable gardens out back behind the chickens, concrete genders sealed in lead, their doors secured from inside with thick steel bars, fringe libertarian end times genders, hetero girly camo gun calendars, apocalyptic tits pinned on brick walls by lone bunks so the men can cross out each day once civil society ends with a pathetic snivel like, please help. Doomstead men live doomstead days already, sealed in extreme fiction, as if there were ever a way to stay safely self contained, by which I mean the Anthropocene is its own gender, biospheric in scale, its persistent flux from fossil record to Antarctic ice core so uncontainable we all exhibit it, with a local sense of personal chosen expression, strategic or contingent, like fertility, medicalized, tracked, managed, or casual, happy fucking without a condom, risky, govern the odds, leveraged against us, and the blameless microbes seeking homes in our nooks and tubes. So I don't visit his doomstead, a psychic structure I feel in my head as blocked thought I watch play out in the Schuylkill where it pools wide, shallow with silt above Fairmount Dam. I stand on the bank and know I'm not supposed to posit an analogy between the river and my body, but courtesy of this dam, the city siphons its water into me, another human intervention diverting its path, each of my cells a little prison the river sits in. So we're related on a molecular level so intimate. I think I can say it wants speed and movement free enough to jump the strained relation to human needs. It serves without relief, without the hands that hold my bones and tend my fascia that remember a different posture, without blockage or pain, a model for undoing harm done by capital, empowered to frack during record drought, millions of gallons of toxic wastewater injected into earth or kept in open ponds, prone and porous in western counties where river otters have rebounded after last being spotted in the Allegheny in 1899. Otters are raucous and chirp, chitter, chuckle, and grumble when wrestling together or sliding on ice. Playful biophony rivers of mist for a whole century, like brook trout rooting in loose, cool gravel, or the plash of insects fallen from hemlocks, the intact eastern riverine biome, one serious mess of sound and meshed in sound and meshed in biotic patterns as heavy as traffic when the weekend weather is nice, and I ride the early 27 bus to the Wissahickon. It's not that I don't like the city. It's just if biodiversity is a measure of health, the city is by definition sick with people and built structures crowding out other lives. Though I love signs, species persist. The sidewalk moss, probably Bryum argentum, native to guano covered seabird rookeries, this fertile ginkgo stinking up the street with stone fruits crushed underfoot, this nameless fern and a downpipe drain, so modest in scale, like the simple songs of house sparrows everywhere, though this chubby one is hustling a fallen everything bagel of seeds and crumbs. And it's not that I don't like people either. Our sociality, genitals and smells, interesting diction, surprising privacies revealed at parties, bars, and in bedrooms, our genders in acts various and wet as thought product of dissolved salts, washing our brains in rich cognition that falters without water, which can't be taken by the head in the hands and held in the hopes of healing. Its body is too vast, its mind boundless by definition. The world is awake. Be careful, my dears. It is the gender that remembers everything.
Brian, thank you so much for joining me today. That was fabulous.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Brian Teare. Go to our website at chrysalispodcast.org, where you can read his poem, Doomstead Days, and find our book and media recommendations. This episode was researched by Elena Sebulash and edited by Sarah Westrich and Mo Armstrong. Music is by Danielle Rodriguez Vivas. Mixing is by Morgan Honecker. If you enjoyed my conversation with Brian, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Contact me anytime at chrysalispodcast.org, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter and support us with a donation.